Before I climbed Mount Fuji, I was having a relaxing summer. My work days were mostly spent desk warming, which for me consisted of writing and drawing. I spruced up my English board and created 3 separate English displays around my school. I think they turned out pretty decent. Thankfully, I wasn't confined to my desk the whole summer and was invited on a couple awesome field trips. For my first adventure, the Kuroshio ALTs crammed into my car and we flew off into the mountainside. Our destination was an unassuming workshop sleeping on the side of a village. We got sat down by a kind Japanese grandmother and our pottery instruction began. Pottery is fun. It reminds me of playing with Play-Doh as a kid. You sculpt and mold wet clay using a combination of unorthodox tools, like a soup spoon, newspaper rag, and of course your own fingers. I was able to form 2 sake cups, a mug, and a small bowl. They ended up looking like dishes you'd find in a witch's house. My friends made some interesting designs, to say the least. A Shrek plate, which is probably the least offensive, followed by a foot plate, which is to say a plate molded from my friend's own foot. We in Kuroshio are many things, but boring is not one of them. After finishing our abominations, we were treated to the most delicious shaved ice I've ever had. The ice was shaved so fine it felt like freshly fallen snow on my tongue, and an extra sweet honey syrup was poured over top. Tasty and refreshing. Our second adventure took us to the bright and beautiful Kamikawaguchi for some kayaking. After a sunscreen bath and throwing on our swimming gear, the kayak commander and kayak company boss approached us. The commander was bold enough to give me a handshake, which I'm sure he regretted because he too got slathered in sunscreen. We strapped on life vests, extra tight, and were instructed how to paddle. After that, we set sail and were thrown straight into a race. It was Team Prairie Oyster versus the East Blue Sea Cows versus the Juicy Momos. We shredded across the harbor around 3 large buoys. Team Prairie Oyster managed to secure the most races, losing once to the voluptuousness of the Juicy Momos. The East Blue Sea Cows were a little confused, but they had strong bovine spirit. The kayak company boss also chased after us, blasting us with his water pistol and laughing maniacally. Afterwards, we enjoyed swimming in the ocean, looking at interesting coral, and jumping from the pier. Tuckered out, we dried off and walked to the grave of the Korean girl to pay our respects. Her favorite flower, the mugunwa, was blooming. The week before Fuji, I caught a nice fireworks show in Kuroshio. Japanese fireworks seem longer than the ones back in Canada. Maybe because Japanese have more fireworks, or perhaps they spend more time appreciating each rocket. Either way, it was a lovely beachside evening, one of the better fireworks shows I've seen in my life. Tokyo is a daunting city. It alone rivals the entire population of Canada, so it's understandably easy to get overwhelmed by the endless sea of people and concrete. However, the metro system in Tokyo is so good. It makes traversing the city quite simple. I found that through purchasing a Suica card and using Google or Apple Maps, I could easily and cheaply find my way anywhere. Suica and Passmo are rechargeable cash cards that can be used in place of manually purchasing train tickets. Many shops and vending machines conveniently accept them, even at Tokyo airports. As good as the system is, I did find that transferring from one train to another is a little stressful. It usually involves desperately following colored signs through a packed train station on a 3 to 4 minute time limit, looking for the right rail line and platform number. The good news is, trains are so frequent in Tokyo that if you miss your ride, or you get on the wrong train, another will show up in about 5 to 10 minutes and you can easily course correct. If the same thing were to happen in the countryside, you could be stranded for over an hour.
The lowest left. Really? It's not dead. But...
Maybe Tokyo as a whole wasn't so bad, but man, Akihabara was truly an overwhelming place. It boasts tons of hobby shops, used game stores, and all the anime and manga and otaku could ever dream of. I saw so many different anime characters, they all began to blend in my brain, just a conglomerate of sparkling eyes and spiked hair. For shopping, many of the stores were very narrow and built upwards. To properly peruse, you had to ascend a narrow staircase or take a cramped elevator. There are also many department stores packed with all manner of games and technology, even arcades. True to its reputation, there were many maid cafes along the street, and some women dressed as maids beckoning potential patrons to the restaurants. I never went. Reviews say the food is usually below average, and the maid gimmick alone is not enough of a draw for me. Speaking of Akihabara, shops were mostly PG or PG-13, but in many cases all bets are off on the top floor or basement. You're welcome to imagine the treasures and horrors those places hold at your own discretion. The Gundam factory in Yokohama houses one of Tokyo's largest Gundam models. It is truly impressive, especially since it has frequent choreographed shows. Many vendors are set up around the interior of the factory, so you can grab yourself typical Japanese festival food, that is to say, shaved ice, yakitori, the works. Much of the factory is dedicated to the construction of this Gundam and the philosophy behind Gundam design. For example, the displays comparing Gundam to human anatomy, explaining how the different pivot points on a Gundam equate to human joints. The shop at the factory was honestly nothing special. More Gundams were on display in a single shop in Akihabara. Maybe they were specialty models, which is why there were so few. Overall, a nice stop in Tokyo. It's worth mentioning the people working when I visited were very English friendly. Now for the main attraction, Mount Fuji. By professional hiking standards, it is apparently considered an easy hike. I'm here to tell you, as an amateur hiker, Mount Fuji is very challenging, and if I hadn't trained the 3 months before I attempted the climb, I am certain I would have failed. My friends and I took the Subadashi Trail. It begins in a beautiful forest that boasts strange, twisting trees. Past the forest is a winding, rocky trail with small brush dotting the mountainside. Then the trail gets steeper and less forgiving. Few, if any, vegetation grows. The landscape is gray, jutting shale. The higher you climb, the stronger the sulfuric stink becomes. It's not so strong to be overtly noticeable or annoying, but over time it starts to wear at your sinuses. It was a reminder that I was not actually ascending a mountain, but an active volcano. While the trail here is difficult, the view is gorgeous. The Japanese call it the Sea of Clouds. There are maybe 4 to 5 stations to visit on the Subadashi Trail, and a couple of them were closed. This meant at one point I was climbing 3 to 4 hours between bathroom breaks, and considering the trail is wide open, I was left with no choice but to hold it. Some of my friends couldn't, which is honestly not their fault, so drastic measures had to be taken. The stations that were open sold food and drinks, had paid bathrooms, usually about 200 yen to use, and would brand your climbing staff for 300 yen. Our hike up was thankfully uncrowded, so we could use some of the station facilities without much of a wait. The bathrooms were never great, although some were cleaner than others. Some allowed you to flush toilet paper, others had you drop it down a pipe separate from the toilet, others you had to spray the toilet bowl with a garden hose. Urinals often were out in the open of mixed bathrooms and had little privacy. Like I said, not great. In total, it was 9 hours of grueling uphill marching until we reached the station at which we would spend the night. Sometimes the trail was less of a path and more like an obstacle course as we hopscotched and leapt over volcanic rock. After leaving the second last station, exhaustion washed over me like I've never experienced before. Every few minutes I had to stop and catch my breath, my head and heart pounding, my thighs protesting with every step. Progress at this point was painfully slow, and worst of all, the sun was setting behind the mountain. I knew I had to keep pushing forward because if I didn't, I would be climbing in the dark. My friends had almost all hiked ahead of me, and it was much, much too late to turn back around. I had nowhere else to go but up. Mercifully, I reached the final station. It was cramped and busy. Some of the amenities included small curtained-off pods filled with snoring hikers, decent bathrooms, and an open eating area. I found my bed, devoured a meager but welcome supper with my friends, and hit the hay. After an unrestful 8 hours tossing and turning, sweating and freezing, it was time to start climbing once again. The morning mountain was incredibly busy with hundreds of headlamped hikers shambling up the trail to watch the sunrise. I sluggishly strapped on my hiking gear and, together with my friends, joined the pilgrimage. It was about 2 hours of crawling up jutting mounds of smelly shale in the dark, with the added luxury of being joined by several hundred people. The good thing about the crowd was that it was slow, so it was easy to take a second and catch my breath. As light was teasing the horizon, my friends and I shambled past one final torii gate, signifying we had arrived at the summit. Relieved, we found a spot, hunkered down in the frigid dark, and looked to the horizon. Winking lights from towns far below sparkled like stars. We had a perfect viewing. The clouds were alight with fiery reds, oranges, and yellows, backlit by the blue sky and framed by the blackness of the universe beyond. After eating the most expensive cup noodles in the world, we slid back down the mountain, quite literally as the shale at some parts was incredibly loose. Progress was fast, but it still took around 4 to 5 hours for us to complete. Once at the bottom, we had another meal. I had pizza and beer. Finally off the mountain, I dived straight into an onsen. A wise man climbs Fuji once. A fool climbs twice. I think I understand that Japanese proverb a little better now. While an amazing experience, I can't say climbing Mount Fuji is especially fun. I spent the majority of the hike sleep-deprived, in pain, stressed, and exhausted. The amazing scenery and my friends made the climb bearable, but without those two things, it would have just been straight misery. Chris Broad's video on Mount Fuji is titled 24 Hours of Hell, and although he made the Fuji experience worse for himself by not properly preparing, I can't say hiking up prepared makes it all that much better. Safer, certainly, but more enjoyable? Probably not. So, a wise man climbs Mount Fuji once because he trains, prepares, and has a little luck on his side. But also, a wise man climbs Fuji once because once is enough. That's all for now. Take care and be bold.